I think we can all agree that it was an underwhelming performance. They were far off the pace, and there was a lot of negativity early on before the race even took place in the days leading up. Lawrence, we had talked about this a couple of weeks ago that they doubled down on the slim side pods or the zero pod concept in that car. And it felt like maybe the right decision. They got rid of the porpoising, but based on the performance all weekend long, what is going on with Mercedes and what can we expect from them moving forward?
Well, they're miles away from where they want to be and where they need to be. Mercedes are a team that go for world championships. That's what they've done for the past 10 years or so. And now to be in a position where they can't even get close to scoring a victory, it's really bad news. And I think they kind of lulled themselves into a false sense of security at the end of last year. They made big progress through the year with what was quite a radical concept compared to a lot of the other teams. Certainly they were going their own way. No one copied them. No one had come up with a similar idea. But by the end of the year, they'd won a race in Brazil. So they thought, well, if we continue on this trajectory, we'll be fine. I think where they got blindsided was that Red Bull, meanwhile, have quite clearly not put a huge amount of effort into their car towards the end of last year, because they've been putting it all into this year. A key factor being this kind of lightweight chassis, which means they're under the weight limit, which means they can play with it. And that's just unlocked so much performance for them, while they've also been able to develop within that set of regulations. And so Mercedes, with the car they had last year, they set themselves some targets. They felt they were quite ambitious targets. But the reality is, and they hit those targets, but the reality is they were just aiming way lower than where they needed to be. And essentially in Bahrain, they got found out. And I think they realized this during testing. They could see the data coming through. I was trying to put a positive spin on it because historically Mercedes often underperform in testing to then show their real hand in the race. But that was it. And so to turn up in Bahrain and not only be so far off Red Bull, but also to be outraced by Aston Martin and outqualified by Aston Martin, a team that is a customer of Mercedes in that they use Mercedes engine, Mercedes gearbox, Mercedes rear suspension. They use Mercedes wind tunnel to design their aerodynamic package, which is where the big differences are coming from. That was very humbling for the team. And I think as a result, that's why we saw so much negativity from Toto Wolff, from George Russell, about where this team is, because if everyone is completely honest with themselves, they already know they're not fighting for a championship this year.
I'm glad that you used the word humbling, because I think if you're Toto Wolff, you have to swallow your pride in some of the comments that he made. And you guys know the history of this sport better than I. I think I used an analogy on the post-race show from Bristol right after Bahrain in the fact of a front office member drafting a lottery pick and then it not turning out or working out. And they just missed on whether that guy was going to be able to change the franchise. And a lot of front office members will hold on to that player for way too long because they just don't want to admit that their evaluation was wrong. It seems to me that Toto's making kind of a quick evaluation here. And would you, Nate, respect the decision that he's swallowing his pride and saying, hey, this is a hard truth that we have to accept and we got to scrap this thing and move on?
Yeah, I mean, you're completely right about a quick decision. It was literally a 60-minute qualifying session is all it took. And, in the world of Formula One, usually you want to look at a concept over a few races. Bahrain's a very specific place. So I think people were surprised at how quickly they'd done that. And I know that Toto was asked that exact question about, how did you come to this decision so quickly? Why were you so open about it? They could have lied to everyone, said, no, we're happy with this. And then down the line started going a different direction. And I think Toto's quote was, he said, we don't BS you. I mean, he used the full word that I'm hyphenating there. But I think I think they're at a point now, Mercedes, where they really can't hide behind that lie, and say we're happy with this concept, because the drivers were kind of clearly a bit like, well, we're not sure if this is the right thing now. And I think that the sheer scale of how far ahead Red Bull was really kind of accelerated that decision. I think they realized, look, if we keep chasing this concept right now, we could be even further behind by the end of this year, and then we're nowhere, until the rules change again. So I think there's been some pretty difficult conversations behind closed doors. And I'm quite curious. I mean, the driver feedback has been kind of, it's been up and down. They're obviously happy they got rid of the bouncing at the start of testing, but both drivers were pretty clear that they weren't where they wanted to be. So you wonder how much influence that's had behind the scenes. But I think it's got to be, I mean, Lawrence might remember better than me a better example, but it seems like the biggest kind of climb down from a leading team in terms of a concept. I can't remember another team coming out after one race and saying, this design concept we've got is completely wrong. Some teams have said, look, this isn't the concept we're going to have for the rest of the season, and they've said that before the race. But Mercedes have gone from being super bullish about this thing, being like, this is the best thing. This is the best thing for us. This is going to win us titles. To saying, no, it's not going to win us titles. We've got to do more along the lines of what Red Bull are doing. So yeah, pretty remarkable stuff.
I think if
you. Oh, sorry, Katie.
No, go.
I think if you read between the lines of some of what they were saying at the launch, it was quite clear that they knew already that they were in a bit of trouble. They were saying this will get us titles eventually, or this will allow us to fight for the victories eventually. So they knew they were going to have this slow start to the season. The really concerning thing is that Mercedes have pursued some of the other concepts in the wind tunnel behind closed doors at their factory in the design office, and they still came to the conclusion that theirs was the best. So clearly they are missing something quite fundamental in how Red Bull are creating such a fast car, how Aston Martin have made such dramatic gains in such a short period of time. It seems like Mercedes don't understand how their rivals have done that at this stage. And that is worrying for them, because it's not a case of, right, we just go back, into the wind tunnel and, we do this and we're going to find all this time. They've got to understand how Red Bull are doing that before they can start to develop their own concept. And as Toto correctly said on Sunday, they're already a year behind. I mean, realistically, more than that, because there was all the development of the car going into last year. There was all of last year, and now we're here. Toto said that really they've got to focus on they've got to basically pick their design philosophy now for the future and focus on one, because you can't afford to focus on two. One, you'll get a bit lost with development, but also under the budget cap with limited resources, and also under the aerodynamic testing restrictions that all teams have. The teams further up the grid have even more. There's not the bandwidth or the money to go chasing multiple concepts. So they have to change their concept. They think they know that now, but they have to pick one that, first of all, they need to understand, and then they need to know that it's got enough long-term benefits. So it feels like there's such a long way back from where they should be. So I think that's why Toto was the way he was over the weekend. And to be honest, at least he was open. Like Nate said, there was no BS in his comments.
Yeah, Lewis was weirdly chipper, wasn't he, all weekend? I think he genuinely enjoyed the fight with Fernando. So on that Sunday, he was kind of in a good mood from that. And he said, coming into the weekend, he said, I'm a fighter, I don't give up. And I think maybe he relishes this challenge, or maybe he doesn't really. Maybe the severity of it from our perspective is lesser from his point of view. Maybe he's always said he's got huge faith in that team and Mercedes' ability to win. So maybe he does think, hey, we can do this. This isn't insurmountable. But yeah, it didn't quite chime with what Toto was saying, and that was one of the interesting things, that the drivers, they weren't always singing off the same hymn sheet the whole weekend. Toto would be like, this is, he'd be saying one thing, the drivers might be saying something slightly different. I'm not saying they're not agreeing behind the scenes, but it did seem strange. There wasn't, one mood coming out of the camp the whole weekend. It did seem a bit, like people, I think it maybe day to day, especially with the drivers, they might have a better day in the car and they came out feeling a bit better. But George was so different to Lewis on the Sunday.
He was.
I think it made a lot of headlines. He was basically like, if I was making a bet now, Red Bull win all 23 races, they've got the championship sewn up. And that wasn't the vibe Lewis was getting, and George was like, we might not do anything this year. We need to focus on 24 immediately. So, it did stand out a bit.
You have an article right now on ESPN.com, Bahrain Grand Prix overreactions. And a part of your headline is Lewis Hamilton might never win an F1 race again. And then you go into some detail of if that's an overreaction or not an overreaction. Feel free to tell us what you think.
Yeah, so I went with not an overreaction. And I have to clarify, that doesn't mean I don't think Lewis... I'm not saying he never will win a race again, but I'm saying it's not an overreaction to think that we might have seen his last win, his 103rd win in 2021 now, which is so long ago when you actually think about it. But everything that Lawrence just said, when he was saying about how far back Mercedes are, they've slipped quite comfortably to being the third best team, maybe the fourth best team. And if you look at the way F1 is, since I started covering Formula One in 2014, there's been a big three. And the lead team has won most of the races in that season. The second place team has probably challenged for some wins. The third place team might be there to mop some up, but it's quite rare we get all three really challenging regularly for race victories. And look at Fernando Alonso. He's had 10 years nearly without a win, through being in the wrong place, through making bad decisions. And, he spent half of that 10 years at McLaren when they couldn't even get out of Q1 a lot of the time. So I think Lewis is in a position where, he might be able to win a fluke race here or there. But in terms of having a car that's going to put him in position to win races every week. I think that window's gone for him now. And, he's one of the older drivers on the grid, and you can see that opportunity never coming back for him. He had an incredible spell, and the car is such a huge part of it. So, I've been getting some interesting replies on Twitter to that,
Sure.
to that article. But yeah, it's sad as well, because it's crazy. I end that bit by saying that if you think about it, we all look at that Verstappen overtake of Lewis in Abu Dhabi 21, and it's like that was the moment that denied him the 8th championship, obviously, and all the controversy that went around with that. But how crazy would it be if that also denied him the 104th win that he's not going to get? It adds a whole other level to that moment. Not that it wasn't big enough already, but it, you just think, wow, like that literally was like the sliding doors moment for Lewis. If you believe my article, we'll see in a few years. I mean, I'm happy to be proven wrong. Lewis is good at proving people wrong, so I'm sure he'll relish the.
Hope so.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that were saying the same to me, like, well, Lewis will prove you wrong, and I was like, hey, it wasn't a challenge to Lewis. It was more just a statement of, not fact, a statement of quite enthusiastic opinion, I suppose.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.